The blizzard killed the cabin first, not the structure itself. The cabin's walls were standing. The roof was holding. The door was latched. What died was the cabin's ability to function as shelter. The distinction between those two things being the difference that Maren Sohl understood with complete clarity at 4 a.m. on the third day of the storm, when she woke to find the stovepipe frozen solid 12 inches above the collar and the firebox beneath it full of unburned wood that had no draft to catch and no path for its smoke to go, and had simply sat there, cold and useless, while the temperature inside the cabin dropped to within 8 degrees of the outside air. Outside the air was minus 31 degrees. She knew this because the small mercury thermometer nailed to the exterior doorframe had been readable through the window glass at dusk the previous evening, and minus 31 was what it had said then, and the temperature had not been rising. Inside the cabin, her breath came in hard white clouds that did not dissipate. The water barrel in the corner had a 2-inch skin of ice across its surface. The lard tin on the shelf above the stove had gone solid. These were not the conditions of a cabin with a working heat source. These were the conditions of an unheated box sitting in a Montana blizzard, which was precisely what the cabin had become the moment the flue pipe froze. Maren Sohl was 38 years old and had been alone on the Judith Basin claim for 14 months, since her husband Peter had ridden to Lewistown for supplies and taken a fever there, and died in the back room of the only boarding house in town before anyone thought to send word to his wife. She had found out from a rider who came through the basin 6 weeks after Peter was already in the ground, and she had sat with that information for one evening and then gone back to work. Because the claim did not care about her grief, and neither did the Montana Territory. Winter building on the northern horizon. She had survived the previous winter without incident. That winter had been cold, but cooperative. The flue pipe had stayed clear. The wood supply had held. The cabin had functioned as designed. This winter was something different. 3 days of sustained minus 30 cold, with a wind that drove snow horizontally across the Judith Basin floor and packed it into every gap and joint and opening it could find, including, apparently, the 3-inch diameter of her stovepipe cap. She needed heat. She had no heat source. The stove was useless without draft. She could not clear the flue cap from outside. The wind and the cold made the roof inaccessible in any condition she was willing to survive. She had wood. She had no way to burn it safely in the cabin without a functioning flue, unless she was willing to fill the room with smoke and carbon monoxide, which she was not. What she had, in addition to the wood, was the memory of something her father had described to her when she was a girl in Norway, a practice used by fishermen on the northern coast during the worst winter storms, when their small stone shelters lost their heat sources, and the men inside them had to survive on body heat alone until the weather broke. Her father had called it a varum kasse, a heat box. The principle was the enclosure of a very small air volume around the human body, small enough that body heat alone could raise its temperature to survivable levels without any external fuel source. Her father had described it as a last resort. This was a last resort. She had approximately 2 hours before the cabin temperature dropped to the point where her body's heat production would no longer keep pace with the heat loss through her clothing, and she would begin the slide toward hypothermia that she had seen take a man in Norway when she was 12 years old, and had never forgotten. The progressive slowing, the false warmth, the sleep that was not sleep. 2 hours was enough time to build what she needed if she moved without stopping. She went to the corner where she kept her lumber scraps. Peter had been a careful man who wasted nothing, and the corner beside the door held the accumulated offcuts of 18 months of claim building. Pine boards of varying lengths and widths, ranging from finger-thin strips to full-inch planking, all of it dry and clean and stacked with the neat precision of a Norwegian carpenter's son who had learned that a scrap of wood had value until it was proven otherwise. Maren sorted through it with her lantern held close, selecting by thickness and width, pulling pieces and laying them against the wall, in the sequence she would need them. She needed 6 panels, 4 walls, a floor, a ceiling, each panel large enough to enclose a human body lying flat, with 6 inches of airspace on all sides. She did the arithmetic in her head. Her body was 5 feet 4 inches long and 20 inches across at the shoulders. A box 6 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet high would give her the air volume she needed without being so large that her body heat could not raise it to survivable temperature. She picked up the hammer from its peg on the wall and began to build. The cold in the cabin was already deep enough that the nail heads she pulled from the scrap bin were painful to hold with bare fingers, and she worked in wool mittens that reduced her grip precision but kept her hands functional. She had built the first panel, the floorboard, 4 planks of inch-thick pine face-nailed across 2 cleats, before the feeling in her feet went from painful to numb, and she stopped and beat her boots against the floor hard enough to drive sensation back into her toes before continuing. She had 4 panels framed when the lantern oil ran out. She kept building in the dark. She finished the 6th panel by feel. The darkness in the cabin was complete, not the partial dark of a moonlit night bleeding through window glass, but the total dark of a structure buried on 3 sides by drifted snow with no light source remaining and no outside illumination reaching the single south-facing window through 3 days of whiteout. Maren worked by touch and memory, her mittened hands finding the nail heads by pressure and the plank edges by running her palm along the floor until she located them. The hammer swings she aimed by the sound of the nail tip on wood, a light tap to set, then 2 full drives that she felt through the handle as solid resistance when the nail seated correctly, and as a sideways deflect when it did not, requiring extraction with the claw and a positioning. She drove 41 nails in the dark. She pulled and reset 9 of them. The box, when assembled, was not square. She could feel that without a level, the floor panel sat slightly off plane, where the cabin floor beneath it was uneven, producing a diagonal gap at the joint between the floor and the north wall panel that she packed with a strip of wool cut from the hem of her outer skirt using the skinning knife she kept on her belt. She packed the remaining corner joints with the same material, cutting strips by feel, pressing them into the gaps with her thumbnail until the draft she could feel on her face when she put it close to the joint stopped. She had built the box against the cabin's south wall, using the wall itself as the 5th surface, and reducing the lumber requirement accordingly. The south wall was the most sheltered face of the cabin, least exposed to the northwest wind, carrying the least cold transfer of any surface in the structure. Using it as one panel of the box reduced the air volume the box needed to heat by roughly 20%, and gave her a solid backing that her own lumber could not have matched for airtightness. She opened the box from the top, lifting the ceiling panel she had left unattached at one end, and climbed in. The space inside was dark and close, and smelled of fresh-cut pine and the lanolin of her wool clothing and her own breath. She lay flat on the floor panel, with approximately 5 inches of clearance above her face, when she raised her hand and touched the ceiling board. She pulled the ceiling panel down over the opening and pressed it against the wall and held it there. She had driven 2 small finishing nails into the wall surface above the box at the correct position to hook the ceiling panel's edge cleat against, holding it shut without requiring her to maintain pressure. She reached up with both hands, found the cleat, seated it over the nail heads, and released. The box was closed. For the first 30 seconds, nothing changed. The air inside was the same temperature as the air outside the box, which was the same temperature as the cabin, which was 8 degrees above -31. She lay still and breathed slowly and resisted the urge to move, because movement consumed calories she needed to conserve and generated heat only in short spikes that did not sustain themselves. Still, air warmed by body radiation faster than moving air, warmed by exertion, and she needed sustained warmth, not spikes. At 4 minutes, she felt the change begin. Not warmth, precisely. The cessation of the particular cold that had been pressing against her face and hands for the past 2 hours. The cold that had weight to it, that pushed through wool and skin and arrived at the body's surface with the insistent pressure of a material seeking equilibrium. That pressure eased. The air directly against her face was no longer pulling heat away from her skin at the rate it had been pulling it outside the box. Her own exhalations, trapped in the small volume, were contributing their warmth back into the air she was breathing rather than dissipating into the larger cabin space and being replaced by cold. The box was working. She understood the physics of it the way she understood most things her father had described, not in the vocabulary of physics, which she had never studied, but in the functional terms of cause and effect that a practical woman applies to practical problems. Her body produced heat. Heat required a volume to fill. A small volume filled faster than a large one. The box was the smallest volume she could build around herself while still fitting inside it, and it was filling with her heat at a rate the cabin had never been able to fill, because the cabin was orders of magnitude larger and venting through gaps she had never fully sealed. At 20 minutes, she removed one mitten. The air against her bare hand was not warm by any standard she would have used in ordinary conditions. It was warmer than the cabin air outside the box. She put the mitten back on and lay still and listened to the blizzard work at the structure around her. The low, sustained roar at the roof line, the creak of the wall logs settling under wind load, the faint percussion of wind-driven snow against the window glass, and she felt those sounds recede from immediate threat to background condition, which was the specific transition that told her the box had done what she needed it to do. She was not comfortable. She was not warm in any satisfying sense. She was sustainable, which was the only category that mattered in the Judith Basin at -31 degrees, with a frozen flue pipe and no light, and 41 nails driven in the dark. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking herself deliberately each time by the method her father had taught her for watch-keeping on the fishing boats, a conscious commitment before sleep to a specific duration, the body honoring the commitment with a reliability that had never failed him and had not yet failed her. Each time she woke, she exhaled deliberately against her hand to confirm the box temperature was holding, confirmed it was, and went back under. The blizzard ran another 19 hours. Maren was awake when it stopped. She heard it stop, the roar at the roofline dropping in register, the wind percussion against the window glass going intermittent and then absent, the quality of silence that follows sustained noise arriving in the cabin like a physical presence. She lay in the box for another 20 minutes after the wind died, listening for the return that sometimes came with these storms, a second surge that arrived in the false quiet and was worse than the first. It did not return. She unseated the ceiling panel cleat and pushed the panel up and open and sat up inside the box and looked at the cabin around her. Gray morning light was coming through the south window, thin and horizontal, the light of a sky that had spent 3 days delivering weather and was now, temporarily, empty. The cabin was still cold. The stove was still useless. The flue pipe was still frozen. But the light was coming through the window, and the wind was not in the roof, and the box had held her through the night. And that was the complete inventory of what the morning required. She got out of the box and picked up the hammer and went to the door. The flue cap had packed with wind-driven snow, compressed into something closer to ice than powder. Maren could see it from the ground, a white plug visible at the cap's opening when she stood at the cabin's east corner and looked up at the roofline in the gray morning light. 3 inches of diameter, completely blocked, the cap's rain hood holding the packed snow in place against the draw that should have cleared it. She needed to reach it. The roof pitch was shallow enough to walk if the surface was clear. The surface was not clear. 2 feet of storm snow sat on the boards above the drifted base, unconsolidated and unstable. The kind of surface that would hold a person's weight for 2 steps and then release without warning. She went to the barn and got the longest pole she owned. It was a lodgepole pine rail she had pulled from the fence line the previous autumn, when one section had heaved in the frost and needed resetting. 16 feet of straight-grained timber, 2 inches in diameter, still carrying its bark. She had kept it in the barn because straight 16-foot poles were useful, and Pater had taught her to keep useful things. She carried it to the cabin's north wall, stood it vertical against the eave, and used it to prod the flue cap from ground level, working the pole tip into the cap opening at an angle that let her apply lateral pressure against the packed snow plug without pushing the cap off its seating. The plug broke on the 4th prod. She heard the draw start before she saw any evidence of it, a low whistle in the pipe that rose in pitch over 30 seconds as the draft established itself and pulled air upward through the system. She went inside and touched a match to the shavings in the firebox she had laid the previous night, before the pipe froze, and the fire caught in under a minute, the flame pulling strongly toward the pipe collar in the clean draft of a system that was finally doing what it was designed to do. She sat in front of the stove with her coat on and her hands extended toward the iron door and waited for the heat to arrive. It took 40 minutes for the firebox to build enough thermal output to raise the cabin temperature above freezing. She tracked it by her breath, the cloud reducing in density, the individual exhalations becoming less visible, then invisible at close range, then gone entirely. At the point where her breath disappeared, she removed her outer coat and kept her wool underlayer and sat in the chair she had pulled close to the stove and looked at the box against the south wall. It was not impressive to look at. 6 pine panels face-nailed with cut nails in the dark, the joints stuffed with wool strip packing, the whole assembly sitting slightly off square on the uneven cabin floor. 2 of the corner joints had pulled slightly during the night, where the green wood in the cleats had dried and shrunk in the cold, opening gaps she had packed, but not fully closed. The ceiling panel sat at a faint diagonal, where the cleat hook had not seated evenly in the dark. It was the work of a woman building in mittens by touch in a frozen cabin, and it looked exactly like that. It had held her alive through 19 hours of minus 31 degrees, with no heat source. She pulled the notebook from the shelf above the stove and wrote the box dimensions, the construction sequence, the nail count, the temperature observations at 4 minutes and 20 minutes, and through the night intervals, the wool packing at the joints, the ceiling panel seating method. She wrote it in the same plain sequential style she had been using since the first week on the claim. No interpretation, no commentary. Just data in the order it had occurred and the results it had produced. Then she wrote one additional line that she had not written in any previous entry. She wrote, "Works without heat source. Body only. sufficient. The Judith Basin settlement learned about the box the way settlements learned about most things, gradually and imprecisely, the true account acquiring details in transit that Maren had not included and losing details she had. What arrived at the settlement's collective understanding was that the Sohl widow had survived 3 days of the worst cold the basin had recorded in 6 years by building something in her cabin, and that the something had worked, and that nobody was entirely sure what it was. 2 women rode out in the week after the storm. Maren showed them the box without being asked, still standing against the south wall, still packed with its wool strips, the ceiling panel still hanging at its diagonal. She showed them the notebook entry and explained the principle in the plain language her father had used when he described the Varme Kase to her on the Norwegian coast 30 years prior. A small volume fills with body heat faster than a large one. Seal the volume. Get inside it. Wait. One of the women, a basin homesteader named Frida Arndt, who had come to Montana from Minnesota and had survived 2 bad winters there, listened to the full explanation and then asked Maren to repeat the dimensions. She wrote them on the back of her hand with a charcoal stick she carried in her coat pocket. She built her own version the following week. She told her nearest neighbor. That neighbor told 2 more. By the following autumn, there were 7 heat boxes in 7 Judith Basin cabins, each one slightly different from Maren's original in the way that practical solutions evolve when practical people adapt them to their own spaces and materials. None of the 7 families who built them abandoned their claims that winter. Maren added a proper latch to the ceiling panel in the spring, a small wooden turnbuckle she carved from a pine offcut that allowed her to secure the panel from inside with a quarter turn. She noted the modification in the notebook with the date and the reason and the result. Then she turned to the next blank page. She had already identified 3 improvements for the following winter. She intended to test all of them before the cold arrived. She was not a woman who repeated her mistakes. She was not a woman who stopped at sufficient when better was still available. The basin would deliver another winter, and she intended to be more ready for it than she had been for this one, which was, by any honest measure, more ready than anyone else in the Judith Basin had been for this one already. The notebook had room for 40 more pages. She picked up the pencil and kept writing.